While most teams in the league seem scared to take Shedeur Sanders, the Cleveland Browns, on the other hand, do not. We'll talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast. I'm proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. Despite what's being said about Shedeur Sanders, I don't think the Browns much care. Free agency, primer, we got that for you. How the Browns are likely to address certain needs and some players that could make sense for them. Plus, two more names are going to get revealed on our Locked On Browns quarterback big board. I do want to thank you for being an everydayer with the Locked On Browns podcast and for making us your first listen every single day. Remember, you will find the Cleveland Browns content that you need with Locked On Browns every week, Monday through Friday, guaranteed, with bonus content on some weekends and bonus episodes some days as well. And it's all totally free to you. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you listen to your podcast. And of course, at the Locked On Browns YouTube channel, where you can also get involved in the show, share your thoughts on anything we discussed today in the comments section. This is your team, so be part of the conversation every single day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So there's been plenty of new information or new things said about Shedeur Sanders since the Combine last week, and about where he sort of fits in the big picture of teams' draft boards and how they feel about him. And listen, you've seen the quotes in the comments about how he was too quote unquote brash and arrogant in his meetings with teams, and that now is apparently is plummeting his stock, where some teams are deeming him not even a first round prospect. What's interesting is I just don't know. Like, some of this stuff just makes you laugh. I understand it's silly season and teams are trying to manipulate the conversation around certain players to hopefully get a player to fall to them or whatever it might be. But the simple fact for me is Shedeur Sanders probably isn't falling out of the first round. He's definitely not falling out of the first round. He's probably not even falling out of the top 10. And I'd be shocked if he fell out of the top 6, because there's going to be enough QB needy teams there. The Giants, the Raiders, the Jets probably are going to be part of that conversation, that someone is going to pull the trigger on him. It's just bound to happen. Even in a year where it's a down quarterback class, you're probably going to get a couple of these guys going in the first round, most notably Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, and maybe Jackson Dart sneaks in there as well. But I just don't know how, if the takeaway for some of these teams after combine meetings was that he's too brash and arrogant, I just want to know where you've been. Like, where have you been in scouting Shedeur Sanders and following Shedeur Sanders this entire season? Because, think about it. Like go back and watch the press conferences he's had all year at Colorado. He's kind of come off that way. His dad is Deion Sanders. He's one of the most brash and arrogant human beings that there's ever been. And that wasn't a problem for teams when he was coming into the league. People love that. People embrace that. He's a Hall of Famer. To me, that's not I don't have a problem with somebody being brash and arrogant if they're going to go out and they're going to work hard and they're going to back it up on the field. And Shedeur Sanders certainly has the work ethic. I think that's been proven. And he has the desire and the genes to be great. I don't know what's not to like here, unless you just look at the tape and say, and that's what it should come down to. Like, the tape should tell the story. And if he wasn't being called a second round player going into the combine, I don't know how all of a sudden after the combine that's the consensus. It just doesn't add up for me. I get that everybody's in the same place. They're all talking. I don't know that I got the sense of the combine that it was a resounding feeling that he's a second round pick. I think that seems a little extreme. I think he probably still goes in the first round. Like I said, I think he probably still goes in the top 10 and maybe even the top 6. But I don't 100% understand where all this is coming from. And if the reasoning is just he came off, a certain way in our, he has too big of an ego in our team meetings with him. I just don't know where you've been. It's the Sanders family. And that shouldn't be an issue. I think as this relates to the Browns, and this is the important thing here, because I do want to kind of get into how the Browns feel about him. And my sense from hearing things at the combine, what's been reported since, obviously, and just things that I've kind of heard and picked up on is that the Browns do like Shedeur Sanders. Now, I don't know if they like him enough to take him at 2. I don't know if they like him enough or if they like him more than Cam Ward necessarily. That's the big thing that I think is still sort of being sorted out, and it's why I've had my doubts about how they feel about this quarterback class in general. And I even said that last week at the combine. But the feeling that I get, and again, reading tea leaves, talking to people, reading reports that others have obviously shared as well, is that the Browns do like Shedeur Sanders. It's just a matter of where's the value for him as a player for you to pull the trigger. Is it 2, where Mike Florio apparently says anybody who drafts him super early is you might as well get a pink slip if you're a head coach. Like you're basically signing your own pink slip. Like all these just crazy takes that are being thrown out there about him. I just don't buy it. Like I think Shedeur Sanders has shown you he can be an NFL level prospect. I get the arm strength is something that people are a little bit concerned about, but I think he can do everything else. And from a Brown standpoint, I talked about this last week too. He brings something to the table that whoever the Browns quarterback is going to be has to have. No, Cleveland is not New York. It is not the New York market. There's not even more pressure because of the size of the market that you're in and just like what comes with playing in a city like that. But Cleveland does bring a lot of pressure with that position specifically because they haven't had the Cleveland hasn't had a franchise quarterback since Bernie Kosar, since the 90s. Like it's been so long that there's always like if you're drafted and you're dubbed that immediately, there are some stakes. Like there are some outside pressures that come with living up to that expectation. And it takes a certain type of player, a certain type of person to be able to fulfill that. Baker Mayfield, I think, fit that billing. And then things kind of fell apart with him, obviously. But as the Browns talk about like needing an adult in the room, which was the thing that they threw out there, the report that was out there about part of the reason why they're moving on from Baker Mayfield. They thought he was too immature. There were some issues in the locker room with him and other players, and they wanted an adult in the room, apparently, right? I think Shedeur has already shown that he can be the adult in the room. And I trust that his upbringing, the background he comes from, being Deion Sanders' son, and what he's already kind of gone through, he brought it up, like going to different programs and turning them around, making them winners. Like to me, like he screams adult in the room. He screams the ability to lead at a high level already and come in and not be like not be flustered by the moment not being too big for him. So that's something that I think is massively attractive for the Browns. It's one of the things that I can tell you they generally do like about him, on top of what the tape tells them. And so the more and more I think about it, the more and more I believe they are bound to pull the trigger on one of these quarterbacks that are at the top of the board here. I don't know which one quite yet. And it'll probably will come down to like how they feel about, what a lot of it will come down to like how things are going to play out at 1, right? Because the Titans are going to trade back and the Giants are going to move up and they really want Cam Ward, then are the Browns comfortable taking Shedeur Sanders at 2, or does it become something where they take somebody else and then they're sort of finding a way to trade back up if they think Shedeur Sanders is going to fall to like the teens and get him there? Again, I don't think he's falling out of the top 10 personally, but maybe that does happen and it would create an opportunity where the Browns could move from 33, the first pick of the second round, to get back up to get him. And you get almost like this mock draft that we saw recently where the Browns came away with Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders, ironically enough. Like I know that people are having some fun with some different things like that, different iterations of how this thing could go down. I don't necessarily think that's how it's going to play out, but I can tell you that the Browns do seem to be comfortable with both these quarterbacks on some level. And it will ultimately come down to, are they comfortable enough with Shedeur that they'll take him at 2 if they miss on Cam Ward? Are they more enamored with Cam Ward so much that they would want to trade up and get him, as we've talked about throughout this week? Or are they sort of on a level playing field where they're like, listen, we can take one or the other, and whoever gets there to us at 2, we're going to pull the trigger. But the more and more we hear about the Browns and their interest in these guys, the more and more it seems like quarterback will be in play here early on in this draft at some point, and that they are mostly looking at or honing in on those 2 guys who, by the way, both came and visited the organization this week as part of their top 30 visits leading up to the draft. And it's not a coincidence that the Browns got their meetings with those 2 quarterbacks, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, their pre-draft visits with them out of the way early on in this process before next week when free agency opens. They are clearly trying to get a lay of the land. And Albert Breer talked about this a little bit on the Rich Eisen show this week. Like they are getting a lay of the land of like, okay, how do we really feel about these guys? They are trying to get the full picture of how they feel about these two quarterbacks before they go into free agency and have to make a decision on what veteran option they're going to get. Because again, they are going to they're going to get a veteran of some capacity that could maybe be a starter for them if they get a rookie that they need to sit for a year or whatever. And then they're going to pair him, that veteran, with a rookie. Which rookie it is remains to be seen. Which veteran it is remains to be seen. But they are checking all their, they are dotting all their T's and dotting all their T's. They are crossing all their T's and dotting all their I's on this quarterback conversation, this rookie class, how they feel about Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders before they open the floodgates into free agency next week and pull the trigger on any singular decision at that position moving forward. So they're going to have, I think, a pretty clear idea of what they're thinking going into next week. And this is where you'll start to get, I guess, like you'll start to feel like things coming out about where the drafts are leaning, where the Browns are leaning in the draft could be more true, because again, they're trying to, they're sort of finalizing and working through those decisions and coming to their final thoughts on it before free agency opens next week, because they got to have a plan on the other side of how they feel about these quarterbacks, because they are going to take one at some point. So it's not a coincidence that those guys had their meeting so early, and this now sets the stage for the Browns to sign a veteran next week and then figure out which quarterback they like the most, or if they're comfortable with both. And as I've said, it feels like they are comfortable with both as things stand right now, and that Shedeur Sanders is very much in play for them, unlike many teams in this league that apparently feel like he's got a second round grade all of a sudden because he didn't have some good interviews at the combine. I don't know. But regardless, Shedeur Sanders, the truth about Shedeur Sanders with the Browns at least is that they like him. And I think they see him as a viable NFL quarterback if they were to take him coming up in April's draft. Along the lines of the quarterback position, we know it's one of the biggest need for the Browns this offseason, but there's plenty others. We will do a free agency primer for you. We'll go position by position, needs that they have, how I think the Browns will address it, either in free agency or the draft, and some players that could be in play for them. We'll get to that coming up next here on the Locked On Browns podcast. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you missed the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. With the NFL season behind us, you already know I'm betting a ton of Cleveland Cavaliers basketball. They are a legitimate title contender. And if you don't believe me, go check the sports books yourselves. You can bet on them as a futures bet to win the title at FanDuel, or you can just go game by game, play some single game, same game parlays, and dabble in some other games if you want to as well, with opportunities to cash out big. You can also use and you can also go and use the app, which is super easy. And when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com today to join. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so free agency is looming large next week as the new league year begins officially 4 p.m. next Wednesday. We know the legal tampering period begins early in the week before that, and that is where some of these deals are consummated, if you will, by teams and agents and players. Now, what's interesting, I always find it interesting that like the moment the new league year opens, or not even like the moment that you get legal tampering opening, you already got all these teams that are like reportedly agreeing to terms with players. Like the legal tampering thing is so funny to me because there's clearly conversations going on before this that pave the way for these deals to get done even before the new league year opens. It's always kind of a funny thing about the new league year, the start of the new league year. But the Browns obviously have plenty of holes to fill. Quarterback chief among them, as we talked about in the first segment, in their pursuits of Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward. I can wholeheartedly say what I'm going to do is go position by position to some of their top needs and tell you whether I think they're going to address it in free agency primarily or the draft or both. And starting with quarterback, I think the answer is both. They will find a veteran option next week in free agency or via trade or whatever. And maybe it's Kirk Cousins if the Falcons actually pull the trigger on moving on from him. We'll see. And I believe they will draft a quarterback at some point in the draft. It's looking more and more likely that it's going to be one of the top two guys, Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward. But they will address that position specifically with both of those avenues, both free agency and the draft. It's just a matter of who and who they sort of settle on and what it all kind of comes down to when they make their grand plans for changing this roster. And Andrew Berry's already been pretty adamant that this quarterback room is going to look a lot different next year. So stay tuned for that. That brings us to another key position on offense that's a need, running back. And I do think there will be some pursuits made in free agency in the running back market potentially. The only thing is, like, if the Browns are trying to sign a veteran in free agency, and I do think they'll explore that route. I think they are going to add somebody. I just don't like some of the names that are out here. They're not all that enticing. Like to me, they fall in the same sort of line as like a Nick Chubb, right? There's a few, I guess, like Raheem Mostert's now a free agent. Like, I'd be interested in that. He's 32, so he's getting up there in age. But like, all these guys have flaws, most of them, or issues. Like, none of them are like a front line guy for you. I mean, they could be if they stay healthy. But like, I've seen J.K. Dobbins linked to the Browns, but like, he comes with similar injury issues that you're now worried about with Nick Chubb. Why not just bring back Nick Chubb? I guess because Dobbins is 3 years younger, but it still is like similar problems. I do think Najee Harris is kind of interesting. Like, there's been talk about the Browns or Nick Chubb signing with the Steelers, so it would be kind of funny if they just swapped running backs. But I also think that this team feels pretty highly in terms of Jerome Ford as like being part of a split backfield. And if your plan is to have a split backfield, you might as well just draft a guy and get younger at the position and find a new like front line starter in the backfield for you. And so that's where I think the draft is probably the primary route they go. So I think it's a little bit of both. But I do think running back gets addressed more so via the draft with a deep, deep class that this is. Caleb Johnson, I think, makes a lot of sense. He ran a lot of zone, outside zone offense in Iowa. I love Quinshon Judkins, as I said. I think Trevion Henderson can make some sense, though, too, the Ohio State guys. And there's others down the list, but those are three that I kind of highlighted. But I do think the draft is primarily where they find a running back. But I wouldn't be surprised if they survey the landscape in free agency as well and maybe make a smaller move there. Wide receiver, obviously another one. The skill positions always are front line that we want to talk about. And I do think free agency is maybe the main place the Browns will find a wide receiver to pair with Jerry Jeudy. Not to say they won't draft one. Andrew Berry does like drafting wide receivers, especially in the third round. But I do think this team is going to prioritize trying to make Cedric Tillman a bigger focal point in this offense next year. I think they liked what he showed you in year 2 last year. And they have high hopes for his ceiling and him kind of growing into the role that he plays moving forward. So I think free agency becomes like where you maybe find another guy to pair with Jeudy at the top of this depth chart. I've mentioned Braxton Berrios before. I think, he's a cheaper option that I think has some upside and can do some different things for you. Sort of a gadget guy, a guy that can play in the slot. Like, I like what he brings to the table. And so I think, and a speedster. So I like him. Now that Tyler Lockett has been released, I kind of like the idea of like a veteran like that. That's probably going to come pretty cheap to the Browns, and a guy that I think still has something left in the tank. If we think Jerry Jeudy's the number one wide receiver, which I do now, he's convinced me, then I think Tyler Lockett could be a nice compliment as kind of, again, a guy that's getting older, but still has something left to give. And Brandon Cooks is another guy that kind of falls in that same box. I've always sort of had an infatuation with Brandon Cooks. I think he still can provide something. He did for the Cowboys last year a little bit. So I think he's a nice sort of supporting role at this point in his career. But I like the idea of Brandon Cooks. That brings us on, staying on the offensive side, to left tackle. I think the draft is probably where they address this. It's tough for me to identify like a name right now because there's still so much in flux at the top of the draft board. And if the Browns were to trade back, I think like Will Campbell or Kelvin Banks Jr., like they sort of come into focus if you traded back. I guess here's the one thing I'll say. If you wanted to add a veteran in free agency, Kelvin Beachum from the Cardinals could make some sense as a guy that's going to come pretty affordable. I think SpotRack has his number at like $4 million per year, a little over $4 million per year. So the Browns could swing something like that, and maybe that fills the void. But if they wait and don't address that in free agency, I think that's going to tell you a lot about how this team views that position going into next year. That could mean that they're going to put a lot of DeJuan Jones there and see what he can do. And it probably means they're focusing on that being something they address more so in the draft. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball. Defensive tackle and defensive end. I think both of those are probably more draft driven, but we know this team likes that. First of all, because those two positions are two of the deepest in this draft. It's defensive line and running back are the deepest positions by far in this draft class coming into the NFL. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. But we know this team, Jim Schwartz especially, really values defensive line depth. And so somebody like Javon Hargrave, who just got released by the 49ers today or on Thursday, is a name that could be in play, an aging veteran that could provide something for you in the middle. Dante Fowler Jr., who's a free agent from the Commanders. I think he had 10.5 sacks last year. I think you could find a role for him. And we know the Browns have done this like run a pass rusher program over the last several years to pair somebody with Myles Garrett. And again, Myles Garrett might not be here next year. We'll see how the trade situation pans out. But I think he could be in play on top of obviously addressing those positions in the draft. And, you might need somebody who's more of a frontline complement to Garrett if you're assuming he's going to be here next year that you find in free agency if you don't draft somebody like Abdul Carter at the top of the board. So not that there's not other guys that can fill that and be, valuable in the draft, but I think there's some options out there for the depth that this team likes to bolster up front as well on in the trenches on defense. A couple other positions on defense. Linebacker, I think, is a free agency ad. Dre Greenlaw is a guy I brought up before. I think you can get him on the cheap. He's coming off of injuries. Brown's got to take some flyers on guys like that. And if this is really a situation where Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is done, like if his career is over, you need guys that can play that position. And a prove-it deal situation for somebody like Dre Greenlaw, I think, could be beneficial to the Browns and something that they could lean on. I think cornerback is a draft thing. Browns always draft cornerbacks, or I should say Andrew Berry always drafts cornerbacks. So I'm assuming they'll find one there. I also think, too, some people are saying this is a bigger need for the Browns. I'm not buying that. I think they still feel pretty highly that Martin Emerson Jr. is going to be okay. You have one good year, one bad year. If he's somewhere in the middle, I think they can live with that. So I think they're going to probably address that in the draft and not make it a free agency ad. And then safety is another one because we know Juan Thornhill is no longer with this team. I actually think they're going to address that internally. I think they just go with like Ronnie Hickman, DeAnthony Bell potentially. Like I don't think they go out and they spend big on a safety. I don't necessarily think they prioritize it as a massive, day 1 or 2 need in the draft either. Andrew Berry's kind of struck out at filling that other safety role. And so it's an interesting one, but I think that they probably just stay internal to address that one. Do you agree with me on any of these in terms of how the Browns will address these positions of need this offseason? Let me know in the comments section here at the Locked On Browns YouTube channel, or you can hit me up on social media at Spencito_ as always. Final segment, and as we've been doing the last couple of days, I will reveal 2 more quarterback names on our Locked On Browns quarterback big board. We'll get to it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. All right, slowly but surely, we've been revealing the names on our quarterback big board. I'm trying to get this up to about 15 names, and we're closing in. We're getting closer and closer by the day. The last 2 I gave you on Thursday were Justin Fields was number 8 on the list. Daniel Jones was number 9 on the list. And the guys previously before that, if you're new to the podcast here, were Sam Darnold was 7th. Jackson Dart, one of the rookies coming out from Ole Miss, was 6th. Derek Carr, who I just can't quit, was 5th. And then the top 4 consisted of Kirk Cousins at 4, both of the 2 rookies in this class that are at the top of the board, Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders, whichever order you prefer, you can put them in. And then number 1 was Matthew Stafford, who obviously we know was off the board. But this is just a projection of like the guys, how I rank them here at the Locked On Browns podcast that I think would make the most sense for the Browns and who I would want to see them maybe pursue and go after to fill that quarterback void. And we continue the list with numbers 11 and 12 10 and 11, I should say, on this list. And I think this is where more of the rookies start to sort of come and play here for the Browns. And these would be guys that you're sort of taking chances on later in the draft and hoping that they're projects that you hope turn into something. But Tyler Shuck out of Louisville is going to be number 10 on the list. He's been talked up a lot since the Senior Bowl. Seems like he brings some good traits to the table, and that injuries are kind of the thing that derailed some of his hype or his stock in his college career. And people seem to be sort of convinced that he could be in the mix for being, one of the top 4 or 5 quarterbacks taken in this draft just in general. He's probably up there in the conversation with Jackson Dart as one of the next names on that list, I think, at least how I've seen it play out right now. And he's got some upside. So I like the idea of Tyler Shuck as the 10th option here. I don't know that I think at this point, again, if you're drafting a rookie, further down the list or as the day 2 or 3 guy, it's obviously like they're more of a project. They're not as seasoned, and you're not necessarily sold that they're going to be your franchise quarterback. And so I think you have to keep that in mind with somebody like Shuck, or Shuck, excuse me. But yeah, there's some promise. There's some promise there. And I like what I've seen from him throughout this pre-draft process, a prospect that I, by the way, didn't know a lot about coming in. And I've tried to sort of study more and watch more and learn more about. And so there's something to his game. And it's clearly caught the attention of NFL scouts as well, because he has risen up boards since the sort of pre-draft process in the offseason began here. That brings us to number 11 on the list, which is a name that Clevelanders will be pretty familiar with, and another rookie in this class, Will Howard. Listen, I know Will Howard had a rough combine in the eyes of many. It was a weird thing. It's funny. Shedeur Sanders actually came to Will Howard's defense. He said, the man just won a national championship. It's hard to throw to receivers that you don't have chemistry with. Cut the man some slack. Give the guy a break. And I tend to agree. Like I think we sometimes put too much stock in these combine workouts, and they're throwing against air and whatnot, and we let it be sort of gospel. I implore you to go back to the tape. The tape is always the most important thing. And when it comes to Will Howard's tape, yes, there's reason to feel like, maybe he was lifted up by the talent around him. That Ohio State roster was world class. I mean, best team in college football this year by far. So he was lifted up by that. But I think like the moments that you point to with Will Howard came during the playoff run. It was the big throws to Emeka Buka, Jeremiah Smith in the championship game against Notre Dame, when you need a big play to convert a big third down and seal the deal. So he made some throws under pressure, under duress. He found some opportunities to use his legs in certain spots. He bought time. He stood in the pocket and delivered some throws confidently. Like he transformed even from my perspective, from a guy who had some limitations and I had a lot of questions about, to a guy who seemed like he had confidence and could do something at the next level. If he can play the way he did in the playoff. And let's face it, Ohio State, even though they had the best roster in college football last year, they were tested during that playoff run. He played 2 SEC teams. Texas was really good. Tennessee was good. Oregon was maybe the second best roster in college football. And then Notre Dame was awesome. So you were playing legitimate NFL caliber teams and rosters across from you. And he came up big in those moments. So I just think there's something about Will Howard, and I get it. My Ohio State bias is probably shown a little bit here, but it's not like I have him super high on this list. He's 11th. If you're down the list to this point where you're looking for a quarterback that you really are trying to put some stock in and build around, and find your to stabilize the position for next year. If you're on option 11, you're sort of SOL anyway, I guess is a good way to put it. So, I like the idea of Will Howard as a project, same way I feel about Shuck, where, he'd come in, he wouldn't start immediately, and you'd have to sort of get him some time to get adjusted and maybe learn some things and coach him up. But I like to leave room for coaching and that sort of allowing a guy some time to get better at the next level. And I think that Will Howard would take well to that. I think there's some opportunities there for him to get better as a player. And here's what I'll say too, even if the Browns don't take Will Howard as like, this is the guy we're going to sort of we're going to build into a potential franchise quarterback at some point and develop, for like a long-term solution, I'd be open to them if they took Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, drafting Will Howard later just as another quarterback. It doesn't hurt to do it, right? I mean, the Commanders, or I guess Washington, did the same thing when they drafted RG3 and then Kirk Cousins, right? So it's not that far fetched to draft multiple quarterbacks, and that would certainly set the stage for like you having a mulligan, if you will, like another chance to develop a quarterback. And we talk about transforming the room. Bringing in 2 rookies would certainly transform the quarterback room completely for this Browns team and add a lot of potential to that group moving forward. So Tyler Shuck, Will Howard, those are number 10 and 11 on the list. I will try to reveal 12 and 13 over the weekend, and that'll just leave us with 14 and 15 from Monday's episode of the show, which means there's plenty more to come here with the Locked On Browns podcast. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, so you can subscribe to Locked On Browns and make it your first listen every single day. For your second listen, head on over and check out the Locked On NFL Draft Show, or you can keep it local. Check out Locked On Cavs, Locked On Guardians. Thank you for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network and with Locked On Browns. I will talk to you again real soon, Cleveland. Have a nice weekend. Peace.